was told you have a job? Point shoot.
Yeah, Tuesday.
Welcome to Screen Recaps, and today we are going to be recapping the first 2 episodes of The Man in the High Castle. When the new world begins, we're introduced to Joe Black. Joe receives a business card from a man in a movie theater. He is told the business card will lead him to a job before making his exit. He immediately takes down the man, Don Warren, and inquires about the job. Joe is prodded about his youth before finally accepting the position and receiving a firearm. He is escorted outside and put into a truck before Nazi soldiers arrive and open fire. Joe is instructed to travel to the neutral land of Colorado, while Warren is captured and taken into custody. Next, we skip over to San Francisco and introduce ourselves to Juliana Crain. Juliana seems to be a karate instructor. After the session has concluded, she is invited to tea but turns down the offer. Instead, she plans to meet her colleague the following morning. She heads to the store where she runs into her sister Trudy. Trudy tells her not to tell her mother about the encounter and also reveals she got a job. They separate soon after. Juliana returns home to her parents and hears her mother complain about the Nazi soldier on her television. Eventually, she hits the bar and meets with her boyfriend and jewelry designer Frank Frink. They're interrupted by Ed McCarthy, who has an insatiable hatred for the Nazis. Moments later, Juliana makes her exit. On the way home, she runs into Trudy, who gives her something and runs off. Seconds later, Trudy is gunned down on the streets. Juliana heads home and finds out that the item was a reel of film. She pulls out an old projector and surprisingly projects the movie onto her window. The movie shows the Americans winning the war. She replays it over and over before Frank comes home and tells her to put it away. He also explains that the man in the high castle has been producing the propaganda films and that Hitler has been ordering them to be destroyed. Meanwhile, Joe continues on his journey. He takes some pills to wake himself up before driving on. In the morning, Juliana speaks to Frank and tells him about Trudy's bus ticket to Colorado. On the back, the ticket has a place and time. Frank attempts to transport Juliana and the movie reel to the police station, but Juliana talks him out of it and insists she will do so herself. Once he leaves, she takes off her necklace, which Frank made, and leaves. She runs into her Japanese karate colleague on the street and blows off the tea party. We also see that she has the movie reel in her purse. Next, we jump to the Nazi embassy in the Japanese Pacific States. Arrangements are made for the arrival of the prince and princess. Nobusuke Tagomi insists the furniture in the room is inappropriate. Ambassador Hugo Rice agrees to have the furniture replaced. When the Japanese men exit, Hugo learns about Chi. In the elevator, Tagomi reveals that he is worried about the future due to the Führer's illness. On the road, Joe gets a flat. During this time, we see Warren being tortured by Nazi soldiers who attempt to extract information from him. Unfortunately for them, they fail to do so. Warren is identified as the leader of the resistance, and he pretends the truck was sent to Alabama. The Nazi admits they already knew where the truck was heading and what it was carrying. The Nazi leaves, but the punishment continues. Meanwhile, Joe receives assistance from a friendly cop who even shares his lunch. The pair speak about the policeman's tattoo, which reveals that he was a soldier in the war. Moments later, ashes begin to fall from the sky. The cop admits the ashes are from the hospital, which burns cripples and the terminally ill on Tuesdays. Moments later, the pair separate and Joe continues on his way. Next, Juliana runs into the man who got Trudy into the business. He attempts to obtain the reel, but Juliana refuses to give it up. Instead, she boards the bus and prepares to leave for Colorado. Meanwhile, Tagomi meets with Mr. Baines at the airport. The pair enter a vehicle and speak in private. While there, Mr. Baines confirms his true identity, Rudolf Wegener. Rudolf provides Tagomi with information. He insists the Nazis will most likely attack once Hitler's out of the way. Next, Frank speaks with his boss, Mr. Matson. He asks him if he saw the designs. Mr. Matson admits he did, but that Frank should do the job that he has been given. Meanwhile, Juliana meets a strange woman, Katie Owens, on the bus. They speak for a while before Juliana falls asleep. When she awakes, she believes Katie has stolen her belongings. She pounds on the window and fails to get out of the bus before the door closes. However, her belongings were with her all along. Joe makes it to Colorado and places a phone call. He gets no answer and decides to check out the cargo inside of the truck. Nothing of interest is found in the back, so he checks underneath and finds a reel of film. Afterwards, he successfully crosses into Colorado. Meanwhile, Obergruppenfuhrer John Smith returns to Warren to find him passed out and his handler missing. The man is ordered to continue the beating. Juliana finally arrives in Colorado. She discovers and enters the Sunrise Diner. Meanwhile, Frank Frink gets a visit from Inspector Kido. Frank's place is searched, and he is questioned about Trudy before Juliana calls. Frank answers, but Juliana has already hung up. Inspector Kido leaves without any evidence. Meanwhile, Juliana eats while waiting for someone to arrive. Eventually, she tells the waiter that she cannot afford to pay. Thankfully, Joe Blake enters and saves her from trouble. They head outside and wind up sharing a drink together. Juliana gives the name Trudy. During this time, we see Frank pulled from his home. Joe departs and answers the phone. He speaks with John Smith and he confirms that he was able to make it into Colorado without difficulty. When the second episode begins, Frank Frink is taken into a cell, beaten, and stripped naked. In Colorado, Juliana Crain is unable to sleep, so she gets up, heads outside, and rendezvous with Joe Blake. Together, the pair decide to go watch the sunrise. They do and enjoy the experience before returning back into town. There, they chat about one another's life, and Juliana asks Joe what he would do if he was able to do anything in the world. He admits it would be anything other than driving. Afterwards, Juliana heads into the restaurant and obtains a job from Lem Washington. Meanwhile, we switch to Obergruppenfuhrer John Smith's home and meet his family. He instills the importance of bettering the country into his son before getting a phone call from Joe, who insists he hasn't met his contact yet. John Smith believes it and suggests the contact is suspicious. Inspector Kido pays a visit to Frank and attempts to extract information from him. He fails in his endeavor. Back at the restaurant, Juliana continues working and watching the clock. She still seems to believe she will meet someone. Juliana approaches a man and sees that he's reading the Bible. During this time, Joe sits around and watches television. He pulls out the film reel and contemplates its purpose. Meanwhile, Tagomi meets with Ambassador Hugh Rice. The Nazis attempt to acquire information about the films from Tagomi. He admits they're dealing with it, but he refuses to give up any more intel. When the appropriate time rolls around, a man from the previous episode calls for his bill. Juliana rushes over and gives it to him. It is the man with the Bible from earlier. He tells her about a line from the Bible and tells her to pick one up to see what it entails. Meanwhile, John Smith and a colleague ride around and speak about the films and the man in the high castle. Their vehicle travels down an alleyway, they get blocked in and gunfire rings out. John's colleague is shot and debilitated while John escapes from the car and fires back. John manages to take down all of his enemies before backup arrives. At work, Ed McCarthy asks his boss if he can leave and check on Frank, who has failed to show up and isn't answering his phone. Meanwhile, Randall tries to convince Frank to hold his tongue when questioned by the Japanese. Frank admits he doesn't want to hear it. Meanwhile, Juliana takes a break and heads to a bookstore. There, she meets with a Jeff Bezos lookalike, Carl, and purchases a Bible. John Smith returns to headquarters and questions how his location could have been discovered when he has changed his route consistently. He vows to track down the potential traitor. Meanwhile, Frank attempts to break his chains, but Randall reminds him that an escape attempt would be futile. Ed McCarthy visits Frank's place and finds it a total mess. Joe Blake visits the bookstore and purchases The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He also attempts to obtain information about Juliana's purchase, but fails to do so. Juliana returns to the motel and reads the portion of the Bible, which the man was speaking about. It speaks about a grasshopper, and she connects it to the High Castle man's film. She rushes to the payphone and attempts to call Frank. Surprisingly, a man with a Japanese accent answers the phone. Meanwhile, Tagomi attempts to get secrets out of Rudolf Wegener. Inspector Kido meets with Frank's sister and her family. He takes a picture of them and puts them into a waiting room. He takes the picture to Frank and admits they're going to be gassed to death if Frank doesn't provide him with the information demanded. Randall pleads with him to remain quiet as Japanese guards rush in and beat Randall. Frank remains tight-lipped and says nothing. Juliana and the Bible man set up a meeting. Joe enters the restaurant and remains suspicious. He returns to the motel room and phones John Smith. He questions him about the Bible man, and John agrees to find out who he is. Juliana visits Joe and gives him a letter to take back to California before leaving to meet with Bible man. Joe agrees to do so. Meanwhile, Frank's family continue waiting while Randall attempts to convince Frank that the Japanese are afraid of film. He goes nuts and screams a bit before he is taken away by guards. Joe opens the letter and finds out that Juliana is not Trudy. He also learns about her backstory and her connection to the film. He heads to a local theater, breaks in, and watches the film. At the same time, Frank pleads with the inspector to kill him and spare his family. Joe returns to the motel and receives a phone call from John Smith. He learns that the Bible man is a dangerous undercover SD agent. Joe is told to steer clear of the man, but he doesn't. Instead, he heads out and attempts to find him and Juliana. Back at the lockup, Katie Owens is brought in and Trudy's belongings are found on her. This leads the inspector to believe that Frank is telling the truth and that Juliana has nothing important. Meanwhile, the SD agent attempts to get the film from Juliana. They begin to fight while Frank is led outside to be shot and killed. Joe arrives in the nick of time and distracts the SD agent. Juliana uses her Hapkido to throw him over the bridge to his death. Meanwhile, Frank is saved and released into Ed McCarthy's care. He learns that his family has been gassed to death. He tells the inspector he knows where to find him when he desires to kill another Jew. The inspector agrees that he knows Frank's whereabouts.